Hi, this is Rachel on Recovery. We're here with Coach Rachel Grant, and she's going to tell us a little bit about herself, and then she's going to answer some questions for us.
Well, hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in and listening. My name is Rachel Grant, and I work with people who have experienced childhood sexual trauma and are really at a place in their journey where they're feeling pretty sick and tired of that sense of being broken and unfixable. And oh my gosh, when is this going to be done already? And I really support them in their healing journey to move from that place to really breaking free from the past and being able to move on with your life. So, Beyond Surviving is all about freedom and healing and feeling empowered and coming to a place of living more in the present and the future rather than in the past. So I've been a sexual abuse recovery coach since 2007, and I work out of San Francisco, but I work virtually with clients all over the country and all over the world.
So we're going to just go into some questions. You wanted to go into more detail about fight, flight, freeze, fawn, submit, and appeasement. I don't know if we've gone into all of that.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, this is, one of my most favoriteest things to talk about. I can really geek out on this topic. For me, my journey really began when I was 10 years old and my grandfather began sexually abusing me. And when this first happened, I went into a freeze dissociative response, though, of course, at that time, Rachel, I had no idea that that's what was happening, right? I just felt a little floaty and disconnected. And then, as the abuse continued and went on, my system is experiencing this injury of trauma, and I'm starting to develop all sorts of coping strategies for navigating, what is happening to me. And eventually the abuse ended. My mom, discovered him one day abusing me. And so she and my father very quickly removed him from our home, which I'm ever thankful for because they really stepped up in this way. But, even though he was out of the house, that didn't really, support me around the actual injury of the trauma. And at that age, I did not want to talk about it. I was in full flight mode now, like run away from it, deny it. I don't want to deal with this. And then, long story short, things, unfolded. And eventually I reached a point in my life where I was ready to talk about the abuse and get some support. And as I began educating myself about trauma, and I did my master's in counseling psychology, I began to be introduced to these concepts. And I really dove very deeply into the neuroscience of trauma. I was just super, it really resonated with me, and it really helped me to start to understand, first of all, what's happening in the context of the trauma experience when we are, living the trauma, experiencing the trauma, and then later on in our lives when we're having trauma responses. And so, we hear often this language of, fight, flight, freeze. So where do we want to start with that? I think, I can kind of break it down on a neurological level, like what's actually happening there, and talk about the differences and the nuances of that. Is that kind of the direction we want to go in?
I guess so. Yes. Let's do that.
Okay. Well, so the first thing I want to do is kind of reorder the things. So I want us to say freeze, fight, flight, because what is always happening in our system when we are experiencing a moment of trauma or activation is freeze. That's the first thing the system is always going to do. It's kind of like everything in your brain just says, stop, hold on, wait a second here. What's going on? And begins to kind of evaluate the danger and the situation. And so that process really has everything to do with the thalamus and the amygdala. So the thalamus is the part of your brain that is always assessing the incoming data. So right now, as you're sitting and you're listening to me speak, you're hearing me. I'm smelling the candle that I just lit, right? And we have sensory data coming in all of the time. And the thalamus is deciding, okay, is there a danger here or not? And so when the thalamus perceives danger, it then sends that data to the amygdala, which is a really important part of the brain. That is where the center of this kind of, freeze, fight, flight response sits. It is also, though, the pleasure center. It also has a lot to do with pleasure and joy. So there's a lot going on in the amygdala. But long story short, when that data reaches the amygdala, it begins to further assess: is there a danger here? Is there a problem? And while it is doing that, it freezes the system. That could be for a second. That could be for a minute. That could be for an hour. And in some cases with like DID, dissociative identity disorder, we can be in dissociated states for longer periods of time. So once the amygdala has assessed the data and figured out, what kind of response do we need in this moment and is available to us? If we can fight, if there's a sense that we can overwhelm the threat, we can overpower the threat, then we go into a fight response. If there's a sense that we can run away, we can get away, we can escape, then we go into flight. And if neither of those options are available, we remain in the freeze state, the dissociated state. Yeah. And so meantime, while all this is going on, the data from the thalamus is also going to the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that does kind of higher order processing and thinking, and it can take that data and assess it in a further, more nuanced way. And then the medial prefrontal cortex also communicates with the amygdala, so it can send its information back, and it can actually override the amygdala to say, hey, chill out, there's no problem here. And we've all experienced this. Like, Rachel, say you're walking along and something falls in your peripheral vision. What's the very first thing that you do?
You run.
Yeah, right. You just like kind of jump, jolt, get out of the way. You don't like pause and consider like, should I move? What do do I need to jump? No, your body just takes over. That very quick automatic response is that thalamus amygdala communication. But then you kind of look, you catch your breath and you look and you go, oh, it's just a stick, right? But that delayed response has everything to do with how the brain is comprised, because the information goes very quickly from the thalamus to the amygdala, but it takes a longer time for that data to go from the thalamus to the prefrontal cortex and then back to the amygdala to override that activation. And so, all of that is fine and well when it's a stick that falls, right? But when we're talking about trauma, right, and our body and our nervous system is being injured in this moment, and then if we have repeat trauma, what ultimately happens on a brain neurological level and on a nervous system level is that our system just gets a little bit out of whack. So, the thalamus just starts to, perceive everything as danger. Like, that's dangerous, that's dangerous, that's dangerous. And so it's constantly pinging the amygdala and igniting the amygdala. And so then the amygdala is constantly flooding our system. And as that happens, it kind of impairs other parts of the brain. So when the amygdala is activated, it kind of shuts down the prefrontal cortex to a certain extent, which is why it's really hard to make good decisions. Ever been there, Rachel, where you're like in the middle of something, you're like, this is probably not the best decision, but I'm going for it anyway, right? It's like, oh, damn, right? Because the prefrontal cortex is not there. It also shuts down the Broca's area, which is our speech center, which is why when we're activated, when we're triggered, it can be really hard to find language or words. This is really important in the context of looking back at past trauma, because sometimes people will say things like, well, why didn't I yell? Why didn't I say no? And sometimes, quite frankly, you just could not. The Broca's area was shut down because your amygdala was in charge, trying to help you survive. And then it also impacts the hippocampus, which is kind of like the note taker of the brain. So the hippocampus is responsible for, gathering the data of an experience. And so when we're in a state of activation, the amygdala kind of says, hey, I don't need you, note taker. Like, we don't need to write all this down, right? We just need to survive and get out of here. And so that's exactly why we have gaps in trauma memories. And then sometimes why we just don't have memory at all. We have sensory or physical body sensations, but we don't have conscious memory. And so, for me, understanding all of that was super important. First of all, in putting into context my experience of what I felt when I was being abused. But then also for later in my life, a big part of healing is getting the nervous system back online, reducing the levels of activation so that we stop feeling kind of hyper alert or hyper vigilant, or on the other side, feeling kind of numbed out or depressed. So that for me was really important, Rachel, because for most of my life, I just felt like this odd bird, right? Like there's just something wrong with me. Again, that feeling of being broken, right? Why can't I handle things the way that other people handle things? Why am I so quick to anger? Why am I feeling like anxious just all the damn time? And as I began to really understand that I had experienced this injury, and then therefore this is what my brain, was doing, but then also the good news that I can repair that injury, and that there are very practical, steps and strategies and tools and processes that we can use such that we can better address, activation and get the nervous system more into a state of regulation more often than not.
Okay.
That became freeing. Mm-hmm.
And I know we've talked about fawn, submit, and appeasement.
Yeah, so I think the thing to understand about this new language that's kind of coming out is that fawn is like a behavioral response. It's a survival response, but it's not something that's necessarily happening in the brain, in the same way that freeze, fight, flight is happening on a neurological level. More, it's a matter of I am in a situation in which I feel maybe threatened or insecure or unsure or uncomfortable. And my coping strategy or my behavioral strategy in this moment is to appease, is to fawn. And that's actually more directly tied to shame. A place of feeling not deserving, not empowered, not good enough, people pleasing. All of those behaviors actually sit under the umbrella of feeling shame-based thinking, feeling like you're always to blame or at fault. And so, yeah, that distinction's a little important because, fawn is not a neurological response to activation. It's more of a behavioral response.
Okay. How does the abuse impact your attachment style? And or how does it?
Yeah, so attachment theory is really fascinating, right? Like there's a lot of great work out there on attachment theory, and for anyone who's not familiar with that, I definitely encourage you to go out and read up on this. My favorite book on attachment theory is Attached. Are You Anxious, Avoidant, or Secure? By Amir Levine. Also, a really great book on attachment is Polysecure. And while that book is talking about the dynamics in relationships where there's more than two people, they really do a great job of talking through attachment because just in a partnership where there are two people, attachment issues are definitely going to come up. But certainly if you add in and have an open relationship or a polyamorous relationship, you're definitely going to run into attachment. So attachment has everything to do with the early stages of development. And so what's true is that like you take somebody like myself, like from the ages of 0 to 10, I had pretty secure attachment, right? I had parents who were very attuned to my needs. They were responsive, and they, were nurturing. It was a safe space. It was a safe environment. And I was given the appropriate amount of kind of like boundaried support along with like freedom to kind of move and explore, but I could always kind of come back to a safe space. And then with the introduction of trauma at age 10, right, for in many ways, having had that secure environment, it helped reduce the impact of the abuse to some extent. But nevertheless, that trauma and then later traumas in my years growing up, right, and then into my teens and then into my adult years when I was in a domestic violence situation for 10 years, all of those experiences impacted my attachment style, right? So then I started to be a bit more anxious attachment. So kind of always anticipating loss, always being on watch. And so we know that early stage, excuse me, is the most critical, those early years of development. So, of course, if you're experiencing trauma in those early days of development, this is going to impact your attachment style, your expectations in relationships, your ability to connect, your ability to be boundaried, and these sorts of things. But just like anything else, I don't think there is anything as anyone who is 100% securely attached, because even like somebody can be really securely attached in one relationship, but in another relationship or context or setting, they might end up feeling anxious or avoidant. So it is a spectrum, but we can certainly move the dial more towards secure attachment, regardless of the trauma that we've experienced.
Okay. What point do you need to help others understand the effects of trauma better?
Say that again?
What point do you need to help others understand the effects of trauma better?
Like at what point, or what is the main thing? Like,
Yeah.
what is the main idea that helps people to understand trauma?
Yeah, that like understand like what helps other people understand the effects of trauma better.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, not to be redundant, but yeah, first of all, contextualizing it as an injury. I think what's really difficult about, abuse is that, aside from physical abuse that often leaves very visible, scars and bruises, sexual trauma is often an internal injury. And so, to try to help people to understand it through the lens of an injury, I think is really helpful. So, there are important reasons why for that. First of all, we can make it an analogy between, look, even though you can't see, like if you saw me with a broken leg, you'd have compassion, you'd help me out, you'd accommodate, right? And I know that you can't see that my nervous system is injured, but that is exactly what it is. And so I'm going to need maybe some accommodations at work or in relationships. And so being able to talk about it through that lens. And then I think for the person who has experienced the abuse, seeing it as an injury is important, because, like if we break our leg, we don't just sit down and say, well, shoot, okay, I have a broken leg, I guess I'm just gonna have to live with it for the rest of my life. No, like we repair it, right? We imagine it, healing. And so it's the same thing with abuse and trauma. It is not a life sentence, right? We can heal this injury, we can retrain the brain, we can shore up the nervous system. And so I think it puts it into a context in which it feels a little more kind of manageable, and something that can be addressed. And it also depersonalizes it a little bit. Like we don't get mad at ourselves for like catching a cold. Like we don't say, oh, what a terrible person I am, and then that's my fault, and oh my gosh, I'm just the worst person ever because I got a cold. We don't do that. It's like, and we can say, hey, we can start to challenge some of that shame-based thinking as well when we start to see it as an injury that was caused by another human being.
Okay. Yeah, I read a book, I think it's called Chronic Shame, and the effects on shame and recovery. It's huge.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, this is the crux of why trauma is so painful, because if we were harmed and we there was early intervention and we were told earlier on, and it was really reinforced, and we were really supported in the belief that, look, what this person did was not okay, this wasn't your fault, there isn't anything that you did or anything about who you are that caused this abuse to happen, then, that internalized messaging that just starts to impact so many different areas of our lives, we would nip that in the bud sooner rather than later.
Hmm.
So, yeah, a huge part of the work I do in Beyond Surviving is about unpacking that. Because I'm working with adults, so they've had lots of years of convincing themselves and gathering the data for why it's their fault. And so it's a step-by-step process to release that. But boy, once we really get it, then there's so much to gain on the other side of releasing that toxic shame.
Well, and I think for those who grew up in any kind of religion, really, that just adds fuel to the fire when it comes to sexual abuse.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think, one of the things that often happens within, faith-based communities is the pressure to forgive, right? There's often a lot of narrative around that, and so that kind of bypassing the person's experience and feelings and giving them the time and the space that they need, in order to actually process through the trauma, in order to reach a place of being able, to let it go, is important. And then, yeah, like if we're in any community, it can be shaming, right? So it can be a faith-based community, it can be your family, where you can get messages of, this was your fault, you did something to cause this, or just the silencing that can happen of, like, we are not going to talk about this, ends up making the person feel, dirty, bad, wrong.
Well, and I think, that in the purity culture, no matter, you know, not that there's anything wrong with purity, but I feel like it just, it messes with people who have been survivors so
Mm-hmm.
badly in those
Yeah,
communities.
yeah, for sure.
So, um, I've heard you say trauma is not a life sentence. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think we've been touching on it a little bit here in our conversation, but just to expand a little bit, that, we've been injured and we want to start to take the steps in order to heal that injury. And, my frustration really in my own process of healing was that, I became very book smart about trauma very early on. Like, I had all the lingo, I knew all the words, and I had all the information, and I had a lot of context for why I was feeling and experiencing the things that I did. But when it came around to, so what do I do about that? How do I really change that? How do I shift that? I kept getting a lot of messages. Now, grant you, this was, back in the, 80s and the early 90s. And so things have started to evolve and change, but a lot of messaging I received was like, well, this is just the way it is, and you're going to have to find ways to cope and deal with that. And, for me, Rachel, that just was a very, like, I just rejected that idea. And so as I started to do my healing work and develop the Beyond Surviving program, I just really wanted to answer the question, what do we actually need to do in order to recover from sexual abuse, such that there are these distinct stages that we're going to go through. Of one, I think every person who experiences trauma goes through the stage of denial, the moment where you're like, no big deal, I'm fine, I'm good. Right? Like, I'm just gonna live my life, I'm sure everything's great. Right? And then there's the moment of, like, shit, things are not great. And you acknowledge, right, like, my life is not the way I want it to be, I'm having all these challenges and problems. And that really moves us into the survivor stage, where we begin to acknowledge the things that have happened. We begin to understand trauma. We become book smart. We start to learn. But what I started to feel and what I started to notice around me is that people were getting stuck. Like, I didn't want to get stuck at the survivor stage. Like, who wants to just survive their life? I was like, nah, that doesn't sound like a good deal to me. There must be something past that. And that's really what Beyond Surviving is. It's about coming out of a stage of recovery, right? So trauma is not a life sentence. We're not meant to be in recovery for the rest of our lives. There is a period and a time where we do focused work to heal and integrate past trauma. And then after that is living. And that doesn't mean you aren't continuing to learn or grow or have experiences or gain insights, but your focus does not have to be on unpacking or unraveling the trauma and being in recovery in the way that you were. So it's really more about being in an empowered state of mind. Okay, so yes, these are the things that I've experienced. And as I live my life, there may be moments where, old narratives or something gets triggered, but that you are, resilient and you have a lot of capacity and you have a really robust toolkit that supports you in responding in those moments so that you aren't taking a lot of your time to kind of navigate through that.
Yeah, and I mean, how long do you think it took you to get out of survival mode and into thriving?
I mean, I would say from the moment when I finally said, okay, I'm going to look at this, that was, when I was around 18, 19. And then that began the very wiggly journey of like trying this, trying that, reading this, trying that out, kind of gathering lots of different things. And then but I would say from the moment when I divorced, and I think I was 28 then, and I really set my mind to basically using myself as a guinea pig and really like, I'm going to just tackle each of these things head on. For me, that process took about a year. And I think that's really important because, I've had clients come to me who are like, well, Rachel, like, I really am interested and I definitely want to do this program, but I'm also very skeptical, right? Like, I've been in therapy for 20 years. I've tried it all. How is this going to be any different? And then on the other side of my 8-month program, they're, often quite surprised, like, holy shit, like, I didn't realize I could, move the dial that much in a concentrated period of time of just 8 months. But I think the reason for that is because I've really spent the last 15 years giving a lot of attention to what we need to do when in order to maximize healing and minimize re-traumatization. And so doing things in that step-by-step guided way, one, takes the pressure off of someone, right? Trauma is like this big mountain of spaghetti. Like, where do I start? And, I think therapy is powerful and important, but often if the therapist is not necessarily creating a roadmap, they're really, letting the person just kind of bring in whatever is on their mind. And that is important for a period of time, but we can also get very lost in the trenches with that. And so everybody's different, of course, everybody's journey is different. So, but it certainly doesn't have to take as long as most people imagine it would.
Yeah, well, and I guess it depends on the complexity too.
Sort of. Sort of. I mean, what's really interesting is that I think it's dynamic and it's layered because, I often say in Beyond Surviving that trauma is not a competition, right? We can't really quantify abuse. So if you have somebody who had, one experience of trauma and then you have somebody who's had 50 experiences of trauma, on the surface, you might say, oh, this person with 50 experiences is going to have a much harder time, a much longer journey. But I've actually seen the reverse happen many, many, many times. And so the extent of the abuse and the extent of the trauma isn't necessarily the main factor in determining resilience and capacity to heal. There are other things that contribute in many ways, much more, I believe. Things like support, resources, the amount of kind of community that you have around yourself, which is one of the things I love that's developed, out of this work, is that it's really not just me. There is this whole community of people now who really support and cheer each other on. And so, if you're feeling really isolated or disconnected, you kind of drop in immediately into a space. where you can heal. So regardless of your circumstances, as long as you're taking one step, right, moving forward, yeah, that's the key.
Okay. I know there's a lot of treatments out there like EMDR, neurofeedback, emotional therapy through chiropractic, just to name a few, equine therapy, art therapy, drama therapy. I know you've probably read the book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is the beauty that I'm going to say it might sound a little harsh, but there's actually no excuse not to heal. These days, given the level of resources that are out there, free and paid resources, given the what we know and the accessibility to help and to support, there are, as I said, there can be factors that are going to slow someone down or can stall someone out or get them stuck, but we can, overcome those. But what I love about, my work is really, I would say, mostly grounded in the neuroscience of trauma and CBT. But if you look at it like as a whole pie, those are the biggest slices of the pie. But also within Beyond Surviving, we are working with somatics. We're working with neurolinguistic programming, family systems, inner child work, mindfulness. And so what's really true, for all of you out there who are on this, healing journey and trying to figure things out, is don't get discouraged. Try something out, try a modality out. It may be your perfect cup of tea, or there might just be like a few pieces that you take from that and then you do something else. And certainly having both brain-based and body-based tools in your toolkit is really important. That's why the work of Peter Levine and Bessel van der Kolk and these people, Irene Lyon, is so important, alongside, the more traditional kind of cognitive behavioral folks.
Okay. Can you tell us about the free gift you'd like to share today?
Yes. Oh my goodness. So, one of the things that is super important to me in the world of Beyond Surviving is that there are a lot of different offerings, everything from completely free to paid programs. And one of the resources I'd really love you all to check out is my 9-page guide on the 3 stages of recovery. So we've touched on it today: the victim, the survivor, the beyond survivor. And so this free guide is going to say a bit more about what all of that really means and represents, kind of the goals for each stage of recovery, a way for you to do a little checklist to kind of assess where you are on that pathway. And then based on where you are in that journey, what are the best types of resources? Because one of the other ways that we end up re-traumatized is that, the resource and the need don't match. And so, of course, what's true is that we can be in one stage in one area of our life and in another stage in another area. But, it's just helpful to kind of think about it in this linear way and then to work with nuances. So you can get that at rachelgrantcoaching.com/checklist. And you can check that out. It's a really great tool.
Okay. Well, is there anything else you would like to add?
Well, Rachel, thank you for this space, for your very thoughtful questions, thought-provoking questions, and for just hosting me and, giving me a space to share my story. I appreciate you, and I appreciate what you're, putting out into the world. And, for those of you listening, I just really want to encourage you that, wherever you are in your journey, don't stop, don't give up. Take it one day at a time. You deserve the absolute best. You deserve to live a life that you love. And if I can be a part of that journey and be a resource or a support to you in any way, you just let me know. Reach out, come check me out at the website, or email me, coach@rachelgrantcoaching.com.
Okay. All right, guys. Thanks for listening. Tune in next Thursday at 10 a.m. And always follow us on your favorite social media or podcasts. And if you have any questions, go to rachelandrecovery.com. Thanks.